Ilara had always been different from the other elves who lived in the floating cities above the clouds of Orion. While her people spent their days studying ancient texts and perfecting their magical arts, she chose to wander the untamed jungle below, where danger lurked around every corner and survival depended on instinct and knowledge. Her violet eyes had seen things that would make most elves tremble with fear. Yet she moved through the wilderness with a grace that suggested she belonged there more than anywhere else. The jungle was her home, and the creatures that lived within it had become her family long before she ever imagined she would meet a human, stranded on her world. It had been 7 years since Ilara had left the floating city of Luminara, 7 years since she had decided that the rigid traditions and endless rules of her people were not meant for her. Her decision had shocked everyone. The Council of Elders had called her reckless and foolish, warning her that the jungle would consume her if she dared to venture into its depths without the protection of the city's magical barriers. But Ilara had felt something calling to her from below, a voice that seemed to echo through her very bones, telling her that her true purpose lay not in the towers of her people, but in the wild places of the world. Her first companion had been Zephyr, a beautiful dragon with scales the color of deep ocean water. She had found him as a young creature, trapped in a hunter's net and bleeding from wounds inflicted by those who sought to capture him for profit. Ilara had freed him without thinking of the danger, using her knowledge of herbs and healing to nurse him back to health over several seasons. When Zephyr had finally grown strong enough to fly, Ilara had expected him to leave and never return. But instead, the dragon had chosen to stay with her. He became her protector and her friend. And through him, she learned the language of dragons, a series of clicks and melodic sounds that humans could never fully pronounce but that carried meanings deeper than words. Years later, the volcanic eruption to the north had changed everything. Ilara had been collecting water from the crystalline springs when the earth began to shake beneath her feet. The sky turned black with ash and the smell of burning stone filled the air. She had rushed back to her shelter and found a young dragon crying in the darkness outside. Ember was small and terrified, her crimson scales dulled by fear and pain. Her wings were singed from the heat of the volcano, and she could barely stand. Ilara had taken her in without hesitation, giving her shelter and care, spending weeks tending to her injuries and helping her regain her strength. But it was Moonwhisper who had truly changed Ilara's understanding of her place in the universe. The silver dragon had arrived on a morning when mist hung so thick over the jungle that Ilara could barely see 3 steps ahead of her. She had heard a sound like wind chimes mixed with the cry of some ancient bird, and when she looked up, Moonwhisper had been hovering above her shelter, watching her with eyes that seemed to contain the wisdom of ages. Unlike the other dragons who had come to her gradually, Moonwhisper had made an immediate choice to stay, as if recognizing in Ilara a kindred spirit who understood something fundamental about the nature of connection and belonging. With her 3 dragons, Ilara had carved out an existence that was neither lonely nor crowded. They had built their home in a massive tree that stood at least 300 feet tall, its trunk so wide that an entire village could have fit inside its hollow interior. Ilara had used tools salvaged from the crashed human spacecraft she had discovered years ago to create chambers within the tree, complete with beds woven from vines and water systems that channeled fresh water from the springs above. The dragons had their own spaces carved higher up in the tree, places where they could rest and spread their wings. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Ilara would spend her days gathering food, studying the plants and animals of Orion, and cataloging her discoveries in journals written in a mixture of Elvish and human languages. She had taught herself human speech by listening to recordings found in the crashed spacecraft, practicing the strange guttural sounds until she could speak with surprising fluency. Her dragons would accompany her on her expeditions, keeping watch for danger and bringing her food when the hunting was good. The communication device had been a mystery to her for years. She had found it buried in the wreckage of the human ship. And though she did not fully understand all its functions, she had managed to decode enough to receive the basic distress signal that arrived on an ordinary morning. The message was unlike anything she had ever received. Most signals were corrupted by time and interference, but this one came through with perfect clarity, as if it had been designed to reach her specifically. The words were simple. Human ship crashed. Survivor needs help. Location coordinates following. The sender seemed to understand that whoever found the message would care enough to respond. Ilara had stared at those words for a long time before deciding what to do. She had never met a human before, never been close enough to actually communicate with one of the legendary creatures that her people spoke of only in whispers and warnings. Humans were described as dangerous and unpredictable, prone to violence and conquest, fundamentally different from the civilized peoples of the galaxy. Yet Alara had always felt that these descriptions were incomplete, perhaps even prejudiced. The recordings she had listened to from the crashed spacecraft contained messages of love and loss, scientific inquiry and artistic expression, concepts that seemed to suggest humans possessed depth and complexity that the elves refused to acknowledge. The next morning, with her 3 dragons forming a protective circle around her, Alara had begun making her way through the jungle toward the coordinates provided in the distress signal. The path was treacherous, marked by ancient roots that seemed to reach up and try to grab her feet, and streams that had to be forded carefully to avoid the strange creatures that lived in their depths. It took her 3 days of travel to reach the location, 3 days during which she debated with herself about whether she was making a terrible mistake. The crash site was exactly as the signal had described it, a sleek human vessel embedded in the earth like a metallic wound in the jungle. Alara approached cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of the knife at her belt, a weapon carved from the crystalline stone found deep within Orion's caves. The ship was still emitting small amounts of smoke, and there were scorch marks around it indicating that the crash had been recent and violent. For a moment she considered leaving and never looking back, but something pulled her forward. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was fate. Inside the ship the air was thick with the smell of burning circuits and something else, something organic and unfamiliar. Alara moved through the corridors slowly, calling out in human speech, her voice small and uncertain in the cavernous metal spaces. She found him in what seemed to be the ship's medical bay, lying on a bed with dried blood on his clothes and a look of dehydration etched into his features. He was clearly human, different from what she had imagined, both more fragile and somehow more beautiful than the descriptions in her books had suggested. Marcus opened his eyes when she entered, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, Alara and the human man from across the stars. His eyes widened in shock and confusion, but there was no fear in them, only a desperate kind of hope. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a dry croak. Alara rushed to help him, bringing water and examining his injuries with the same careful attention she would have given to one of her dragons. As she worked, Marcus watched her with an intensity that suggested he was trying to understand whether she was real or a hallucination, brought on by days of isolation and pain. When Alara finally stepped back and allowed Zephyr to enter the medical bay, Marcus nearly fainted. The great blue dragon moved with surprising gentleness, lowering his massive head to examine the human with a curiosity that mirrored Alara's own. The interaction seemed to convince Marcus that everything happening was real. He asked her name in slow, careful words, and when Alara told him, he repeated it as if testing the way it felt on his tongue. He told her his name was Marcus, and he was a scientist who had been studying isolated ecosystems when his ship had encountered an ion storm he could not escape. Alara helped Marcus to his feet, and together they walked back through the jungle toward her home. The 3 dragons surrounded them protectively, and though Marcus flinched at first when Zephyr brushed against him, he soon seemed to understand that the dragons meant him no harm. By the time they reached the great tree that was Alara's home, Marcus was beginning to believe that perhaps crashing on Orion had been the best thing that had ever happened to him. Marcus spent his first week in Alara's home, recovering from his injuries and adjusting to the reality of his situation. His left leg had been fractured in the crash, and several of his ribs had cracked under the strain of the impact. Alara had wrapped the ribs carefully using strips of bark from a tree, whose sap had antiseptic properties, and she had fashioned a splint for his leg using sturdy branches and vines. Her knowledge of medicine was impressive, born from years of necessity and accumulated experience. She had shown him the plants she used for pain relief and sleep, and within days Marcus began to feel stronger than he had in years. The shelter itself was a marvel of practical engineering and natural harmony. The main chamber of the great tree was nearly 100 feet in diameter, with a roof so high that it seemed to disappear into shadows. Alara had created separate rooms by weaving branches together and covering them with dried palm fronds that were remarkably waterproof. Her sleeping area was simple but comfortable, with a bed of soft grasses covered by blankets made from the shed scales of dragons, woven together with thread that must have taken countless hours to create. A large central fire pit provided warmth and light, and the smoke traveled up through natural vents in the tree, keeping the air fresh. On his second day of consciousness, Marcus asked Alara why she lived alone so far from her people. She had been preparing a meal of grilled fish and local vegetables, her movements efficient and practiced. When he asked the question, She paused and looked at him with those remarkable violet eyes as if considering how much to reveal. Finally, she told him that she had never fit with the other elves, that their society valued perfection and order, while she craved freedom and connection. She said that the jungle had called to her since childhood, and when she finally answered that call, she had never regretted it. Marcus found himself fascinated by everything about Alara. She was graceful in a way that seemed almost supernatural, moving through the jungle with an awareness of her surroundings that he could never hope to match. Her hair, which fell past her waist in waves of silver, seemed to catch and reflect even the smallest amounts of light. But it was her mind that truly captivated him. She asked him endless questions about human culture, about science and art and philosophy. She had taught herself to read human languages by studying the data stored in the crashed ship's computers, and she could recite passages from human literature, with a reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. Zephyr had become Marcus's constant companion during his recovery. The large blue dragon seemed to understand that the human was injured and in need of protection. Zephyr would rest his massive head on Marcus's chest at night, and his presence was profoundly comforting. Ember, the younger red dragon, was more playful, bringing Marcus small gifts of shiny stones and bringing him joy with her innocent antics. Moon Whisper, the oldest and most mysterious of the three, watched Marcus with an intensity that suggested she was making a judgment about his character and worthiness. By the end of his first week, Marcus was able to walk with the aid of a crutch that Alara had made for him. Together they would venture out into the jungle, and Alara would teach him to identify the different plants and understand the behaviors of the creatures that lived there. She showed him which fruits were safe to eat and which were poisonous, how to navigate by the positions of the stars and the movements of the bioluminescent insects that seemed to dance through the air after dark. Marcus had spent his entire life studying ecosystems in controlled environments, collecting data and analyzing it in laboratory settings. But this was different. This was living within an ecosystem, understanding it not as an observer but as a participant. One afternoon, as they sat beside a crystalline pool, Alara taught Marcus the basic sounds of dragon language. She had him repeat the clicks in melodic tones until his human throat produced approximations of the sounds. It was difficult and he felt foolish at first. But Alara was patient with him, encouraging him to try again and again. When Zephyr finally responded to one of his attempts with a low rumble of approval, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment that seemed absurdly disproportionate to the simple act. But somehow being recognized by the dragon felt like a confirmation that he was beginning to belong to this place. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to understand that his crash on Orion had not been mere accident. The probability of survival, the probability of finding Alara and her dragons, the probability of Alara choosing to help rather than ignore him, seemed to combine into something so improbable that it bordered on the miraculous. He had always been a man of science, skeptical of coincidence and believing that the universe operated according to discoverable laws. But his time on Orion was teaching him that sometimes the most important things in life could not be reduced to statistics and probabilities. Alara showed him her journals, hundreds of them, filled with her observations and sketches of the plants and animals of Orion. She had documented weather patterns and migration routes of creatures that had never been studied by human scientists. She had discovered medicinal properties of plants that could revolutionize human medicine, but she had never attempted to share her knowledge with anyone, had never sought recognition or reward for her discoveries. When Marcus asked her why, she said that the knowledge was not for accolades or advancement but simply for the sake of understanding. She had compiled this information for the same reason. She had learned to read human languages and studied human history, simply because she was curious and because knowledge, in her view, was something worth pursuing for its own sake. One evening, as they sat watching the twin moons rise over the jungle, casting everything in shades of silver and blue, Alara told Marcus about her dreams for Orion. She spoke of discovering the secrets that had been buried beneath the jungle for thousands of years, of understanding why there were ancient structures deep underground that seemed to belong to a civilization that had existed long before either humans or elves had achieved their current levels of advancement. She had only glimpsed these structures briefly, had never had the resources or courage to explore them fully, but Marcus could hear the passion in her voice when she spoke of them, a passion that went beyond intellectual curiosity and touched something deeper, something almost spiritual. Marcus shared his own dreams with her, speaking about the scientific breakthroughs he had hoped to make, the ways he had wanted to help bridge the gap between human civilization and the other species scattered throughout the galaxy. He had always felt constrained by the bureaucracy and politics of human institutions, frustrated by the way that important research was often shelved or suppressed if it did not serve the interests of powerful corporations or governments. But Orion, he felt, offered a kind of freedom that he had never experienced before. Here he could study and explore and discover without worrying about who had the funding or the political power to support his work. Ember came to Marcus one night and curled up beside him while he slept, her warmth and presence chasing away the nightmares that had plagued him since the crash. Her young mind seemed to understand his sorrow and fear in ways that were almost human in their empathy. She would purr when he stroked her scales, a sound like distant thunder that resonated through his entire body. Moonwhisper began to bring him gifts as well, leaving interesting stones and crystals outside his room, things that seemed to attract and hold the light in unusual ways. Zephyr taught him how to move through the jungle more quietly, how to read the signs that indicated danger and opportunity, how to listen to the rhythm of the wild in a way that most humans never learned to do. As Marcus's leg healed and his strength returned, he began to help Ilara with her daily tasks. He assisted in gathering firewood and water, helped her prepare food and maintain the shelter. He was not particularly skilled at these tasks at first, but he was willing to learn, and Ilara was patient in her teaching. Slowly, he began to understand the complicated dance of survival in the jungle, the constant awareness required to navigate a world where comfort and danger existed side by side. One morning, about 6 weeks after the crash, Marcus woke to find that his leg no longer ached, that he could move freely without pain or hesitation. He stood and walked to the entrance of the shelter, where Ilara was already awake, watching the sunrise paint the jungle in shades of gold and orange. She turned when she heard him approach, and he could see a question in her eyes. He realized that she had been waiting to see what he would do now that he was fully recovered. He was no longer an injured survivor who needed her care and protection. He was a capable human who could theoretically make his own way or even signal for rescue. For a long moment, Marcus simply looked at her, at the jungle behind her, at the 3 dragons who were stretching their wings in preparation for flight. He thought about his life before the crash, about his empty apartment and his endless hours spent in laboratories and research facilities. He thought about the vast expanse of human civilization waiting for him beyond Orion's atmosphere. Worlds filled with millions of people, yet somehow profoundly lonely. The discovery of the ancient structure happened by accident, much like Marcus's arrival on Orion itself. Ilara and Marcus had been exploring a series of underground caves that she had previously mapped, but never fully investigated. The caves were beautiful in a way that seemed almost impossible, with formations of crystal that caught their torchlight and refracted it into 1,000 different colors. The air inside was cool and dry, and there was something about the caves that made Marcus feel as if he had traveled back in time, as if the very stones beneath his feet contained the memory of ages past. It was Moonwhisper who discovered the entrance to the deeper chambers. The silver dragon had been flying ahead of them, her echolocation able to detect spaces that were invisible to their eyes. She had returned and made a series of sounds that Ilara interpreted as a call to follow her deeper into the earth. Together, the 3 humans and 3 dragons made their way through passages that grew narrower and more precarious with each step. Marcus was grateful for Zephyr's presence, for the dragon's body blocked the light behind them, preventing any sense of complete darkness. Ember stayed close to them as well, her young mind anxious but curious. The chamber they discovered was vast, easily the size of a human city. The walls were covered in symbols that neither Ilara nor Marcus could immediately recognize, but as they examined them more closely, patterns began to emerge. The symbols seemed to follow mathematical principles, and some of them bore similarities to the ancient languages that Ilara had studied. Marcus used instruments salvaged from his crashed ship to scan the walls, and the readings he obtained suggested that these symbols had been created at least 10,000 years ago, possibly much older. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that could only be described as a machine. It was impossibly complex, made from metals that neither human nor elf had encountered before, materials that seemed to defy conventional understanding of physics and chemistry. Some of the metals appeared to exist in a state between liquid and solid, flowing slowly like water yet maintaining structural integrity. Ilara approached the machine cautiously, and as she drew near, it began to glow with a soft blue light. The light was not threatening but welcoming, as if the machine recognized something in her presence that suggested she was meant to find it. Marcus was filming everything with the recording devices from his ship, documenting the discovery in meticulous detail. He knew that this would be the most important scientific discovery of his lifetime, possibly the most important discovery in centuries of human exploration. But as he recorded the machine and the symbols covering the walls, he found himself hesitant to consider what it meant. If there had been an advanced civilization on Orion, what had happened to them? Where had they gone? Had they left voluntarily or been destroyed? The questions tumbled through his mind faster than he could process them. Alara approached the machine and placed her hand against its surface. Immediately, images began to flood her mind. She gasped and staggered backward, and Marcus rushed to catch her before she fell. She told him that she had seen something. Visions of the people who had built this place. They had been creatures of light and energy, not physical beings in the way that humans and elves were. They had come to Orion as explorers and scientists, seeking to understand the nature of consciousness and reality itself. The machine was some kind of repository of knowledge, a way of storing information that could be retrieved by those with the right kind of mind to access it. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Alara spent every available moment studying the ancient structure. Alara found that she could access the information stored within the machine by placing her hand against it and focusing her mind in specific ways. The process was exhausting and sometimes painful, but the knowledge she gained was extraordinary. She learned that the creatures of light had built extensive networks of structures throughout Orion, each one serving a different purpose. Some were designed to study the planet's ecosystem. Others were meant to serve as shelters for travelers. Still others were repositories of scientific knowledge so advanced that even humans with all their technology might need centuries to fully understand it. The dragons seemed to have their own relationship with the ancient structures. Moon Whisper in particular seemed drawn to them, as if recognizing something in their construction that spoke to some fundamental aspect of dragon consciousness. Zephyr and Ember were more cautious, but they too seemed to understand that these places were important and sacred. Alara theorized that perhaps the creatures of light had chosen to leave their knowledge on Orion, in forms that various species could eventually learn to access. Perhaps they had anticipated that different types of beings might evolve on this world, and they had wanted to ensure that all of them could benefit from the knowledge that had been accumulated and preserved. Marcus began to wonder if his crash on Orion had been truly accidental at all. The probability of everything that had happened seemed to stretch the limits of chance, far beyond what even generous statistics could explain. He shared this thought with Alara one evening as they sat in the ancient chamber, and she told him that she had wondered the same thing. She suggested that perhaps the creatures of light, despite being long gone from this world, had arranged for circumstances to bring them together. Perhaps the machines themselves could influence probability in ways that humans and elves did not yet understand. Perhaps Marcus was meant to crash on Orion and find her, meant to help her uncover these secrets and learn to use the knowledge stored within them. As Marcus's understanding of the structures grew, he began to realize that they could be used to communicate across vast distances. Some of the older machines seemed to be designed as transmitters that could send information across the galaxy and beyond. Marcus was torn between his desire to share his discoveries with the human scientific community and his concern about what would happen if powerful governments and corporations learned about the advanced technology stored within the ancient structures. He knew that humans had a tendency to weaponize knowledge, to use tools and technologies for purposes that their creators never intended. Alara shared his concerns. She told him that she had avoided exploring these structures for years, precisely because she feared what would happen if her people learned about them. The elves, despite their appearance of refined civilization, were just as capable as humans of being corrupted by power and greed. There were factions within elf society that sought to conquer other worlds and peoples, that wanted to establish dominance over all the sentient species in the galaxy. If the Elf Council learned about the structures and the technology within them, they would certainly try to take control of Orion and use the knowledge for their own purposes. Marcus and Alara made a decision together. They would document everything they discovered, creating detailed records of all the structures and the knowledge contained within them. But they would keep this knowledge secret from both human and elf civilizations. Instead, they would work together to understand the purpose of the machines and to use their knowledge responsibly. They would become the guardians of Orion's greatest secrets, the protectors of knowledge that could either elevate or destroy the beings who came to possess it. The three dragons played a crucial role in this process. As Alara and Marcus spent more time in the ancient chambers, the dragons seemed to develop their own understanding of the structures. Moon Whisper in particular seemed to communicate with the machines in ways that neither human nor elf could fully comprehend. It was as if the dragons possessed a kind of sensory perception, that allowed them to interact with the technology on a fundamental level. Marcus began to suspect that dragons might be the true inheritors of the technology left behind by the creatures of light, that perhaps they had been designed or enhanced to serve as caretakers of Orion's most precious resources. One morning, as Ilara and Marcus prepared to venture deeper into the structure than they had ever gone before, Zephyr made a series of sounds that caused both of them to stop and pay attention. The great blue dragon seemed to be warning them about something, his tone urgent and worried. Ilara interpreted his message as a warning that they were approaching areas of the structure that were potentially dangerous, places where the old technology might still be active in ways that could harm unprepared minds. She and Marcus decided to take more caution, to move more slowly and carefully, to respect the warnings that their dragon companions offered. As they ventured deeper into the structure, Marcus realized that he had stopped thinking of himself as a human, stranded on an alien world. He had become something new, a hybrid being who understood both human and elf perspectives, who worked in partnership with dragons and with Ilara. His entire conception of who he was and what his purpose might be had been transformed. He was no longer a scientist seeking to make discoveries for the advancement of his own species. He was a guardian, a keeper of secrets, someone who was beginning to understand that true knowledge was not meant to be hoarded or used for power, but shared and protected for the benefit of all living things. The arrival of the rescue ship was announced not by radio communication, but by the machines themselves. The ancient structures seemed to sense the presence of the human vessel as it entered Orion's orbit, and they emitted a series of signals that Ilara and Marcus felt rather than heard. They were deep within the mountain at the time, in a chamber so vast that its ceiling disappeared into darkness, surrounded by machines of such age and complexity that their surfaces seemed almost alive with subtle movements and flows of energy. Ilara received the signals first, experiencing them as a kind of pressure in her mind, like someone calling to her from a great distance. She translated the messages to Marcus, explaining that the machines were informing them of the arrival of external entities, that they were asking whether the humans and elves wanted the machines to take action to protect them or their world. It was the first time that Ilara and Marcus realized the full extent of the technology they had been studying. The machines were not simply repositories of information, but active systems, capable of defending Orion against any threat that might arrive from beyond the planet's borders. Marcus had to make a choice. The rescue ship contained his colleagues and superiors, people who would certainly want to know about the crash and his survival. The human scientific community would want to extract him and his data, to debrief him extensively about what had happened and what he had found on Orion. His government would want to know about the planet and its resources, about the potential for colonization or exploitation, and yet Marcus understood that allowing the rescue ship to land would set in motion a chain of events that could not be reversed. Once humans became aware of Orion and its secrets, the planet would never be left alone. It would become a target, a resource to be fought over and divided among the great powers of human civilization. Together with Ilara, he made the decision to have the machines intercept the rescue ship, not to destroy it, but to communicate with it, to suggest that the crash was not caused by an ion storm but by systems on board the ship that had failed beyond repair. The machines created a false signal indicating that Marcus was dead, that the ship had crashed into Orion's ocean, and no survivors could possibly remain after so long. The rescue team, faced with this information and the inability to reach Marcus's biological signature on the planet below, eventually decided to return to human space and report the loss of the vessel and her crew. As Ilara and Marcus watched the ship disappear into the stars above Orion, Marcus felt no regret about his choice. The life he had known before seemed like a memory from someone else's existence, something that had happened to a different version of himself. The person he had become on Orion was not the same person who had been a member of human scientific institutions and hierarchies. He had been transformed by his time on this world, by the connection he had formed with Ilara and the dragons, by the knowledge he had gained from the ancient structures. But the machines had also revealed something else through their communications with Ilara. There were other advanced civilizations aware of Orion's existence, other species who knew about the ancient structures and the technology contained within them. Some of these species were allies of the creators of the machines, benevolent beings who sought to preserve knowledge and protect developing worlds. Others were less scrupulous, races that sought to harvest advanced technology for their own purposes, even if doing so meant destroying the ecosystems and indigenous populations of entire worlds. Ilara realized that refusing the rescue ship and hiding on Orion would only buy them time. Eventually other visitors would come and they would not be so easy to turn away. She and Marcus would need to prepare the planet and its machines for what was coming. They would need to ensure that Orion was protected, not just from outside invaders but also from the possibility of its own knowledge being misused by those who did not understand or respect its power. Over the following months, Ilara devoted herself to fully understanding the ancient machines and how they could be controlled. She worked with Moonwhisper in ways that Marcus could not fully comprehend, their connection so deep and intuitive that it seemed almost telepathic. The Silver Dragon was clearly accessing something within the machines that was not available to humans or even other elves. Moonwhisper began to speak to Ilara in images and feelings, conveying information about how the machines worked and how they could be used to protect Orion. Marcus, for his part, began to create a comprehensive digital archive of everything they had discovered. He used the computers salvaged from his crashed ship to document the ancient symbols, the structures, the machines, and the knowledge contained within them. But he created this archive with several layers of encryption and protection, making it accessible only to those who had proven themselves worthy of the knowledge. He encoded ethical requirements into the system, ensuring that the information could not be used for purposes of conquest or exploitation. Zephyr and Ember seemed to understand that something significant was about to change. The two younger dragons became more protective of Ilara and Marcus, rarely allowing them out of sight. Zephyr in particular spent long hours flying above Orion, as if surveying the planet and preparing for some conflict that he anticipated was coming. Ember, despite her youth, seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, her playful antics diminishing as she grew more serious and focused. One evening, as they sat in the great tree that had become home to all of them, Marcus told Ilara about his fears. He worried that they were not prepared for what was coming, that no matter how advanced the ancient technology might be, they were still only 3 beings standing against the vast resources of multiple civilizations. Ilara listened to him carefully, and then she told him something that she had not shared before. She said that she had always known that she was different from other elves, that she had abilities that were not common among her people. She had spent years learning to access the ancient structures in ways that even the machines had not anticipated. She had learned to influence probability itself, to guide events and circumstances in subtle ways that would ensure the survival of those she cared about and the protection of knowledge. That was too dangerous to be left unguarded. Marcus found this revelation both comforting and troubling. The idea that Ilara possessed such powers suggested that her decision to help him, her choice to stay on Orion and pursue this path, had been guided by forces that even she did not fully understand. But it also suggested that she had confidence in their ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. If Ilara believed that they could survive and protect Orion, then perhaps they truly could. The machines began to show them visions of possible futures, alternative timelines where different choices led to different outcomes. In some futures, Orion was conquered and stripped of its resources. In others, the planet was destroyed entirely by those seeking to claim its technology. In still others, Orion became a beacon of cooperation and knowledge sharing, a place where different species came together to learn and grow, rather than to conquer and dominate. Ilara and Marcus studied these futures carefully, looking for the pathways that might lead to the best outcomes. They realized that they could not prevent contact from other civilizations forever. The best they could do was to prepare, to strengthen Orion's defenses and ensure that when contact came, they would be able to negotiate from a position of strength. They began to work with the machines to activate ancient defense systems, not weapons but shields, barriers of energy and technology that could protect the planet from unwanted intrusion. They also began to prepare messages to send out into the galaxy, communications designed to reach the benevolent species that the machines indicated were aware of Orion's existence. Marcus suggested that they reach out to the beings who had created the machines, or at least to their descendants or heirs. If a species existed that was advanced enough and ethical enough to preserve knowledge the way the creatures of light had done, then perhaps that species could be allies in protecting Orion. Ilara agreed, and together they composed messages that explained the situation on Orion, the presence of the ancient structures, and the need for protection against those who would exploit the planet's resources and knowledge. As they sent these messages out into the vast darkness of space, both Ilara and Marcus felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened next, they had done their best to prepare. They had protected Orion to the best of their abilities, and set in motion events that might eventually lead to the planet receiving the protection and recognition it deserved. They had also found something more important than knowledge or technology, or even survival. They had found in each other a purpose greater than their individual desires, a reason to dedicate themselves completely to protecting something beautiful and precious from those who would seek to exploit it. Years passed on Orion, and with each passing season, Elara and Marcus grew more confident in their role as guardians of the planet and keepers of its ancient secrets. They had learned to live fully within the rhythms of Orion's natural cycles, understanding the patterns of weather and seasons in ways that had seemed impossible during those first years together. The great tree that had been Elara's shelter became a true home to both of them, and the dragons had become more than companions. They were family, partners in the great work of protecting Orion and deciding what knowledge should be shared with the wider galaxy and what should remain hidden. The machines continued to evolve and change, responding to the presence of humans, elves, and dragons working together within their spaces. Marcus theorized that perhaps the ancient creatures of light had designed the machines to adapt over time, to grow more sophisticated based on the types of beings who came into contact with them. If this was true, then the machines had never been left without guardians at all. They had been waiting for the right combination of species and temperaments to arrive, waiting for beings who could understand that knowledge was a responsibility, rather than a prize to be claimed. Moonwhisper had undergone a transformation that neither Elara nor Marcus fully understood but had learned to accept. The silver dragon seemed to have developed a kind of connection with the machines that transcended normal physical communication. She could enter the deepest chambers of the structures and remain there for days, her consciousness seemingly merged with the technology in ways that the ancient creators must have anticipated, but that neither human nor elf could fully comprehend. When Moonwhisper emerged from these deep communions, she brought new information and insights, things that the machines themselves seemed to want conveyed to the other guardians. Zephyr had become older, his blue scales beginning to show traces of silver and white at their edges. His role as protector had transformed into something more like leadership. When Elara and Marcus made decisions about how to use the ancient technology, or what information to share with outsiders, they consulted with Zephyr first. The great dragon's instincts had proven remarkably accurate. His sense of who could be trusted and what dangers lurked in the wider galaxy, suggesting a wisdom that went beyond his individual experience. Ember had grown into a magnificent creature, her crimson scales burnished to a deep red by years of flying through Orion's atmosphere. She had become the bridge between the older dragons and the new generation that had begun to arrive on Orion, as the planet's significance became more widely known. Young dragons from other worlds, driven by instinct or knowledge they could not fully explain, had started to journey to Orion. They seemed to recognize that this world held something important for their kind, something that called to them in ways that resonated with their deepest nature. The first official contact from outside came not from humans or elves, but from a species that Elara and Marcus had not encountered before. They were called the Vain, crystalline beings of remarkable beauty whose thought processes operated on principles so different from human or elf cognition that communication had required the development of entirely new frameworks for understanding. The Vain had arrived with peaceful intentions, carrying greetings from the council of benevolent species that the machines had indicated existed throughout the galaxy. Through the Vain, Elara and Marcus learned that the creatures of light had not simply abandoned Orion. They had evolved into something else, becoming beings of pure energy and consciousness that existed in dimensions that human and elf minds could barely conceptualize. They had left the structures and the machines as gifts to developing worlds, as a way of accelerating the growth of less advanced species without directly interfering in their natural development. The machines were not tools of domination but instruments of elevation, designed to help species reach their full potential without destroying themselves in the process. The Vain had come to ensure that Orion would not be claimed by the predatory species that sought to exploit worlds for their resources. They had arrived with an offer of protection and alliance, inviting Elara and Marcus to join a galactic community of species dedicated to peaceful coexistence and mutual advancement. It was an offer that both of them had anticipated and feared in equal measure. Acceptance would mean that Orion would be drawn into the affairs of the wider galaxy. That contact with other species would become inevitable and ongoing. Elara and Marcus made the decision together, consulting with the three dragons as always. They agreed to accept the Vain's offer of protection and alliance, but on certain conditions. Orion would remain a protected world, open to peaceful visitors but closed to any who came with intentions of conquest or exploitation. The knowledge contained within the ancient machines would be shared gradually and carefully, with other species being allowed to access only the information that they were ethically prepared to handle. The dragons of Orion would be recognized as the primary guardians of the planet, with humans and elves serving in supporting roles. The Vane agreed to these terms and brought representatives from other peaceful species to formalize the alliance. Ilara stood with Marcus and the three dragons as they witnessed the signing of agreements that would determine Orion's future for generations to come. She felt a deep sense of rightness about the decision, knowing that they had found a way to protect the planet without condemning it to eternal isolation. But the most significant development came not from the Vane or any other external force. It came from the machines themselves, from a revelation that they had been building toward over all the years that Ilara and Marcus had been learning to work with them. The machines showed Ilara visions of her own past, of her birth and the circumstances that had led her to become different from other elves. The truth was both simpler and more complex than she could have imagined. Ilara was not purely elf. Her ancestor, many generations back, had been one of the creatures of light. A member of that ancient species had chosen to incarnate into physical form, to live among the developing species of Orion, and to prepare the world for a future where different beings might come together in harmony. That ancestor had lived a single lifetime and then moved on, but their legacy had been passed down through the generations, creating a line of elves who were inherently capable of understanding and interacting with the ancient technology in ways that others could not. Ilara's entire life, from her childhood when she felt drawn to the jungle, to her decision to become a guardian of the structures, had been guided by this connection to the creatures of light. She had not been following her own desires alone. She had been answering a call that ran deeper than consciousness, responding to an inheritance that she had not known she carried. The machines showed her that her meeting with Marcus had not been chance either. They had been guided toward each other by currents of probability that the machines themselves had influenced, nudging events and circumstances in subtle ways to ensure that the right beings were in the right place at the right time. Marcus accepted this revelation with grace and understanding. He realized that in some ways, his own journey had followed a similar path. His crash on Orion, the specific way that events had unfolded, the precise timing of everything that had happened since his arrival, all of it suggested that forces beyond his understanding had been working to bring him to this moment and this place. As years continued to pass, Ilara and Marcus became legendary figures in the broader galactic community. They were known as the Guardians of Orion, the ones who had protected an ancient world and its precious knowledge, ensuring that the dangerous technology and profound wisdom contained within the ancient structures would be used for the advancement of all sentient life, rather than the domination of the few. Other species came to learn from them, and Ilara and Marcus taught not just about the technology and the knowledge of the ancient creators, but about the principles of cooperation and mutual respect that seemed to be the foundation of everything that truly endured. The dragons of Orion multiplied and thrived, becoming ambassadors of peace throughout the galaxy. Young dragons traveled to other worlds to share what they had learned on Orion, to teach other species about the possibilities that emerged when different beings chose to work together rather than compete. Zephyr eventually passed away, ancient and honored, having lived to see Orion take its place as a beacon of hope and wisdom in a galaxy that too often seemed driven by greed and conflict. Moonwhisper became the guardian of the machines, developing an increasingly complex relationship with the ancient technology that suggested a blending of her consciousness with the systems themselves. She did not die in the traditional sense, but rather transformed, becoming a kind of hybrid entity that could exist both in the physical world and in the digital realms within the machines. Ember became the leader of the younger dragons, fierce in her protection of Orion and its principles.